Welcome to the first video discussion of Paper Towns. As I've said in almost every video I've put up, uh, please excuse the interruptions. Please excuse little things that might happen, such as my cat jumping on me, the dog's barking next door, or in this case, I take a second or two or three to sip some tea. Also, please remember that there will probably be a lot of rhetorical questions. I generally hate rhetorical questions. I certainly don't want to see them in papers. At the same time, in order to at least have the illusion of discussion, I do want to talk and ask some rhetorical questions. So let's get on with it. Pages 3 through 82. First of all, one of the things that struck me right away when I was reading this was the idea that adolescent literature is supposed to be about shaping identity, shaping subjectivity, about a person taking control of his or her life. Certainly, free will versus fate is a discussion that can be had. If you are trying to take control of your life, you want to emphasize your ability to have free will. If you think someone else is taking control of your life, you're going to talk in terms of fate. This novel begins with the idea of a miracle. And as much as I would want to have the power to create miracles, I can't do it with my own free will. There's a comic book character who has a lot of willpower, the Green Lantern, who can create miracles from his power ring, but I don't think that that's necessarily what we're talking about here. The second thing I want you to think about is, what does it do to another human being to have them considered a miracle? Not in the sense of it's a miracle that we're all born, it's a miracle that we get through the day without being hurt because we all do something that can, cause us to get run over by a truck or something, but a miracle. Somehow that she is better, above mere mortals. What would that do to a person? Because I think as you look at Margot Roth Spiegelman, that's one of the things you have to try to figure out is how much of it is her, how much of what happens to her comes from her own acts, and how much of it is the fact that she feels as if she is forced into situations. And so, even with the discussion of a miracle, we are dealing with the idea of shaping one's identity. Strings. There are 3 or 4 recurring motifs in this novel, and one of them is strings. And as you look at the 2 quotations, notice that strings seem to have different meanings and different functions as we go. The strings inside him broke. The idea that we're held together by some strings, and that's when they break, we die. I remember I had a college professor who, in response to a question of why do people die, used the comparison of a perfume bottle. If you open it up and put it out on the table, eventually the scent will all go away. And this seemed to be the same sort of thing. That was a philosophy class, by the way. And now she's this string. I'm hanging on to this string. It's the last thread. I'm grasping at last straws. So one string is an essential element of human life. The second string is more a common metaphor of, the last string I can grasp onto. And then notice that the strings are the metaphor for Margot's life, the idea that she might want to do harm to herself, and her remembering that or her telling Q, excuse me, that she's too vain for that fate. She is not going to let that happen. And then we have this strings crossing and separating, these 2 kites flying up in the air. It reminds me of the kite fighting episode from Big Bang Theory or something like that. The strings seem to be a lot of mixed metaphors, and stylistically, that's one of the things that I think I don't like about the novel. It's fine to have grass represent one thing, because that's one of the things we'll be talking about later. The strings represent something different. But here it seems like the strings are being all things to all people, whatever's convenient at the moment. And we'll try to talk about that when we're face to face, as well as on video several more times. This statement by Margot Roth Spiegelman is something I think I just want you to take a few minutes and look at. It strikes me as revealing sort of two different people, and it strikes me that I look at it differently as an older man, age 62, than I would as a younger man, age 22. The first couple of sentences, the comparison of, plastic versus paper, the idea that everything is kind of fake, okay? The idea of consumerism, whoops, my bad. The idea of consumerism, the idea of houses falling apart, all of that seems rather profound. And then all of a sudden, there seems to be a whole bunch of ego coming into play here. And that ego is the idea I've never once in my life come across anyone who cares about anything that matters. First of all, stop and think of what that's got to be doing for Q, who's been carrying a torch for her for God knows how long. Second of all, there's a lot of ego there. Okay? Never once coming across anyone who cares about anything that matters. Now, we all share in hyperbole, we all say stuff like that all the time. But this woman who has this reputation of being a superstar, of organizing the great toilet papering of their town and all of this other stuff, seems to have a bit more of an ego than she should, even if those observations about things being plastic and things being built to fall apart, and the fact that global warming is happening because we're burning our future to stay warm, the fact that everything around us seems to be paper thin and paper frail, something we learned in 2020 with COVID. Nonetheless, there's a lot of ego there that I think is a crack in the armor that's around the miracle of Margot Roth Spiegelman. One of the things I want to always talk about is the characters and how the characters reveal things about themselves. For example, Q likes to be bored. The pleasant identicalness of his days. He's always liked it. Okay? Margot obviously hates being bored. She doesn't like the idea of getting into college or being worried about getting into trouble. The difference between getting A's and getting D's doesn't matter to her. I can see her saying something like, what's the difference between a doctor who gets C's and a doctor who gets A's? The answer is nothing. They're both called doctor. At the same time, if I'm the patient, I prefer the one who got A's. Okay? She rejects boredom. She rejects routine. She rejects the mundane. Again, that's part of her being a miracle, because miracles, by definition, reject the mundane. But it also seems part of being plastic, because at some point, we all have to grow up. We all have to take responsibility, and we all have to do things that allow us to make a living. We're back to the pleasure of seeing our strings cross and separate and then come back together. We're also back to having my neighbor's dog bark. Some distractions are pretty easy. And excuse me again, I need another sip of tea. My throat is killing me. Okay. But Margot Roth Spiegelman is a hero. Margot Roth Spiegelman is described as a miracle. And yet at the same time, there's a certain amount of emptiness. We saw it in the first quotation. We see it in this quotation about doing stuff never feels as good as you hope it will feel. There's a certain emptiness to her heroics. And obviously, that emptiness is going to be something that drives her to act And her actions obviously will have, cause Q to react because he's carrying the torch for her. If you watch the video about um, the types of novels, this is where Q is acting like the knight in shining armor. This is where Q starts this idea of doing the chivalric romance and living a life of chivalry with Margot Roth Spiegelman as the woman from afar that he can, you know, go slay dragons for. And then once he slays the dragons, she, will reward him with a look or with her handkerchief or something like that. This is starting to set up that chivalric romance part of the novel. And then we have this really strange statement. You look at Margot's eyes and see their blueness and their Margot-ness. If you've taken a philosophy class, I'm guessing at some place you came across Plato's idea of the forms, that somewhere up in the ether, someplace, is an ideal everything, an ideal horse, an ideal chair, and you determine whether something is a horse or is not a horse by how close it approaches the idealness. So Margot is her own idealness. There is an ideal Margot in Plato's world. Okay? And again, I think I've got the same question that I've had before. What does that do to a person to have her put on the pedestal like that? What kind of person puts her on a pedestal like that? Can anybody live up to being compared to the Eiffel Tower? Can anyone live up to being their own perfect form? I think it's important to understand that there's Margot the person, there's Margot the body, there's Q's Margot, there's everybody else's Margot. And although that gets discussed later on in the novel and becomes a major part of the novel, I think you can see it here. If you're reading carefully, this is setting up the idea that Margot is everything to everybody. And again, you have to ask the question, what does that do to someone who has to deal with that idea of being everything to everybody? I think we're going to call it here. This is, I think, are the key points I wanted to get across in class today. Please remember there's that quiz over authors and titles, just so that I can play with D2L. For you guys who are watching on Wednesday, you'll have that on Friday. But the rest of this should be, think about who are these people. We've talked a lot about the characters. Think about the internal conflicts that are being caused by who and what these characters are, and start thinking about how those conflicts and how those characters can start leading to a theme. What connections can we make in our lives? And we'll just kind of play it by ear from there. If you have any questions, you can always feel free to contact me, and we can always chat via email. You can stop by the office. I'll have a mask on, and we'll kind of go from there. Hope you have a good day. I'll see you who are watching this on Friday, and I hope this wasn't too boring for you. Later.